Good afternoon, and what a great opportunity to be here with you today. I guess that I've got to start sharing with you the most frequently asked question ever since I left politics. And that question was, why does a former finance minister leave politics and get engaged with healthcare? And over time, I've learned to develop a few standard answers to that question. That's what politicians always do. I develop standard answers. And my first standard answer is, if you think finance is complicated, try healthcare. And my second standard answer is, of course, and is a true answer, is that I think it's an incredibly rewarding subject to be involved in. It's all about life and death and avoiding illness and making people better. And if you can only play this tiny part in that large machine, it's probably worth it. And my third answer is that as an economist and as a former finance minister, I suffer from professional deformation, and that is that I can't think of any subject without thinking of costs and finance and benefits and investments. And if there's any domain in our economy, maybe even in our society at large, where we haven't come successfully to grip with issues of cost and benefits, it's probably healthcare. So all that together is probably why I'm engaged with healthcare right now and why I'm here today. And the reason I'm here today is I'm officially invited by TEDx to be the party pooper today. That means I'm not only going to talk about the blessings of innovation and technology, I'm actually going to tell you that there's one big problem that technology won't solve, and that problem is the rising costs of healthcare. To make it even worse, I'm not just going to argue that it won't be able to solve that problem. I think it's even going to make that problem worse. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it helps if we all understand and recognize it. And whenever I speak with healthcare professionals about this, they'll tell me I'm a pessimist, and they'll tell me, but look, you underestimate the benefits of technology. You underestimate the benefits of technological progress. We are standing at the eve of a new era with a great technological leap forwards, where we're going to need less doctors and less nurses and less unnecessary visits to hospitals, and it's going to make it all so much more efficient. You know, and being the party pooper, my answer is, well, you know, I recognize all the blessings. I still think it's not going to solve the problem of rising costs. But let's start with those blessings, because that's where the story needs to start. It is incredible for anybody who looks at it how many great things we've been able to achieve with technological developments in healthcare. Just think, in our part of the world, how few people still die of infections and fevers, and how different that was centuries ago. Just think how we've managed to turn life-threatening diseases into chronic diseases. I mean, they are amazing steps forward. And what is probably even more amazing is that these technological developments, they follow upon each other at a quicker and quicker and quicker pace. Just think back of yesterday's technology. Think back of the way we did operations with 5 or 6 doctors around a patient, about paper files, about simple hospital beds, about x-rays. That is only yesterday. And look at what it looks like today. It's all digitalized. The files are digitalized. The technology is modern. Modern hospital beds loaded with technology. That is the way the MRI scan looks today. The other way was the way it looked yesterday, and all that is progress, and it serves to make people better, and it goes at an incredible pace. And it's even more exciting to think of what it would look like tomorrow. Tomorrow's technology is, like Lucien wrote, you know, it's almost like online monitoring of how well you're doing, not just your body weight, but most other body functions. It's all digitalized. This is what they say. This is the next pregnancy experience. It's almost impossible to imagine, and still it goes so incredibly fast. But the question is, will it also solve the problem of rising healthcare costs? And I think it doesn't. And I'll try to give you a few reasons why it doesn't. And the first is, it never worked like that in the past. So why would it work like that in the future? I mean, 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, we all thought we were at the eve of a new dawn of technological progress, and everything would be different. And sure, there was technological progress, but it never made healthcare cheaper. So if it didn't work like that in the past, why would it work like that in the future? And maybe, and that's the second reason, and maybe in part it explains the first, maybe that is because in healthcare, if something is available, we want it. If there is a new technology available, we want it. If we believe there is a new, possibly effective treatment available, we want it. And we don't like to deny it to anybody. You don't like to deny it to her, and she doesn't like to deny it to you. And understandably so. Whatever is available wants to be consumed in healthcare. There's maybe a third dynamic at work here as well, and it's what I call the persistency of the top 10 of life-threatening diseases. There's always a top 10 of life-threatening diseases. And even if you succeed in beating 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 out of that top 10, then number 6 will be your new number 1. And number 11 will be your new number 6. And number 15 will be your new number 10. So there will always be a top 10 of life-threatening diseases worth fighting against. Very understandable, but certainly also a dynamic which makes technology rather increase the problem of rising healthcare costs rather than decrease. And just imagine what happens if we actually succeed in turning life-threatening diseases, in taking them out of the top 10. It almost never happens that the disease actually disappears. What we generally achieve is that we turn a life-threatening disease into a chronic disease, which generally speaking is great news for everybody involved, but it doesn't make it cheaper. And then 5, the fifth dynamic at work here, is that I believe that the more we know about ourselves, the more we understand ourselves, the more we know what we could potentially suffer from now or in the future, the more treatment we demand. Just imagine what it means if we complete unraveling the genetic blueprint of every human being. It probably means that at some point in time, there's going to be a day that when a baby is born, we know from the date of birth what potential diseases this human being will suffer from for the rest of her or his life. And is there anybody here who's then going to say that you're not going to give the treatment needed to treat that, at that point, only potential illness? I don't think anybody will do that. And nobody wants to deny that baby, that potential human being growing up, later phases of his life, that type of treatment. The more we know of ourselves, the more we understand what we suffer from or potentially suffer from, the more treatment we want. And it's dynamics like that that cause healthcare costs rising. It's why economists like myself always say there is potentially an endless demand for healthcare. Whatever is available wants to be consumed. Now that's the way ordinary, down-to-earth economists like myself tend to approach these matters, which is of course thoroughly uninspiring. But there are other ways to look at the same issue. And one of the most inspiring ways to do that, I found, was written down in a recent book. The book is called The Emperor of All Maladies, a biography of cancer. And it's written by an oncologist from New York, Siddhartha Mukherjee. And he writes about 4,500 years of the struggle against cancer. He starts 2,500 years before Christ, with Egyptian doctors writing something in Perch about something that looks like breast cancer. And they then write, treatment, none. That's the start of his story. 4,500 years of the struggle against cancer. And what do you see when you look across that 4,500 years? This is what the guy writes in his book. He says, what you see is that the disease always seems to be smarter than we are. It seems to be more successfully oriented towards survival than we as human beings are. And he believes that the reason is that what makes cancer cancer is that it's about cells multiplying very, very quickly. And if there's anything characteristic about life, it's the ability of cells to multiply. So this is what Mukherjee says. He says, we think we're trying to deal with death in fighting cancer. But what we're really doing is we're trying to fight life. We're trying to fight a parallel species which seems to be more successful at life than we ourselves are. Now, whether you're a down-to-earth, ordinary economist like me, or whether you're a sophisticated oncologist like Mukherjee, we're basically describing the same phenomenon. That every time when you seem to have beaten the manifestation of what you're trying to fight, another one pops up. And it sometimes looks like an endless struggle. And my point here is that we should cherish technology. And technology will, of course, solve many, many problems for us. And indeed, it will raise the quality of life for many of us. But it won't solve the problem of rising healthcare costs because of exactly these dynamics, either described by economists or by oncologists. And the question then is, of course, what do you do? Is this where I leave you? Is this where he leaves us after having read his book? No, it's not. Mukherjee, in his book, quotes Richard Dole. And Richard Dole is the guy who demonstrated the link between smoking and lung cancer. And Richard Dole once said, dying when you get old is inevitable. But dying before you get old is not. And this is basically the philosophy that Mukherjee is trying to sell to the world. And it's a radical change in thinking about healthcare, that we should no longer maybe try to ban death and suffering totally out of our lives, but that rather we should adopt the goal of trying to make it possible for as many people as possible to grow old happily. And you can either arrive at that conclusion by looking at the costs of healthcare and observing that technological progress will only increase those costs further. So therefore, the way we deal with healthcare right now is not sustainable. Or you arrive at that conclusion by describing the nature of illness and the nature of life and the nature of death and our ability and inability to deal with it the way Mukherjee did. And we all then, I believe, have a choice. We all have a choice. And one choice, of course, is to be a naive optimist about technological change. And then technological change is like sand, and we're all like ostriches. We put our heads deep down into it, and we don't see the real dilemmas facing us. Now, I'm in favor of a different choice and a different approach. I think we should cherish and we should encourage new technologies in healthcare because it does carry the promise of improving the quality of life. But at the same time, we should be very realistic that it poses us much quicker than we think is comfortable with very difficult questions about who gets what, who pays for it, and how much is it worth to us. I believe the challenge is that we should encourage technology and at the same time make sure that the benefits of technological progress, because of the rising costs, are still fairly distributed. I think we should cherish and encourage technological progress, but make sure that the benefits still dominantly go to those who need it most and not those who pay for it most. And finally, I think that we should continue our struggle to remove brutal suffering from our lives, and certainly from young lives. But at the same time, we should work towards developing a new paradigm which is not just about fighting death and suffering, but also about accepting death and suffering. That's going to be difficult, that's going to be challenging, that's at times going to be inspiring, but it's inevitable and certainly worth our while. And I guess you can organize many, many TEDx events about it, and I'll be there. Thank you.